the overall situation in Ladakh. What we will bring you are the day's top developments, video of a brawl which took place in Sikkim, and then in a period of time, we'll bring you satellite images and try and interpret them the way we've been doing this for the last several days, where we bring you details to try and explain the build-up in the Galwan region. But first, our top story. Senior government sources have told NDTV that the death of a Chinese colonel in the skirmish in Galwan Valley was confirmed by the Chinese army during talks in the Galwan Valley. Now, the first official admission of the death of a Chinese colonel, a commanding officer, came during talks with the People's Liberation Army in the Galwan Valley, which resulted in the release of 10 Indian officers and men last Thursday. Now, this was the first official confirmation of the death of a Chinese officer in the clashes on the 15th of June, in which 20 Indian officers and men, including the Indian Colonel Babu, were killed in action. You can see images of his last rites there. While India believes that the Chinese suffered up to 45 casualties, there have been no numbers released by the Chinese at all. Now, details of the death of the Chinese colonel come on a day in which India and China held Lieutenant General level talks in Moldo on the Chinese side of Trishul to look at the overall disengagement process. The talks come at a stage when the army has told field commanders that in the event of another physical skirmish similar to what happened in Galwan, they were free to engage the Chinese in whichever way they saw fit, even if it meant opening fire. Now, the Lieutenant General level talks today came on a day when this video emerged of a high altitude skirmish in Sikkim. Let's just play this video out before I explain it. Now, this video and this skirmish is not dissimilar to what we've seen in Ladakh. What you saw over there was a Chinese soldier in the end punched by an Indian Jawan as soldiers of both sides brawl with another. The video lasts a minute or so, a little bit more. It shows Indian and Chinese soldiers clashing with one another. But you've seen that video. But let's quickly move on now to our next big focus before we bring you our guests this evening. For the last several days, we've been bringing you reports on the Chinese build-up in the Galwan region of Ladakh. We've been doing that by acquiring high-resolution satellite imagery, not taking it off someone's Twitter page and then analyzing it. Which brings us to today's satellite images of a key Chinese base, which is seen to supply the entire Chinese push in the Galwan Valley. First, the area that we are talking about. This is the Galwan Valley. What you see here is the Shok River to the left, the line of control marked in red, the site of the clash of the 15th of June, and the Galwan River marked in blue. On the right of the line of control are Chinese positions, and on the left are Indian positions. What you now see is a major Chinese base, 43 kilometers east-southeast of the line of actual control in the Galwan River area. Now, the images acquired from Hawkeye 360 shows a lot of detail, as you can see here. But let's try and explain this to you in even more detail. Let's zoom in for a moment. What you see here is a likely self-propelled artillery and command post. The site shows trucks and camouflage under nets and additional equipment. You see that over here. And a site a little way away down the river basin shows a post with possible armored personnel carriers and trucks. And in terms of the location itself, it's right here. Compared to the Galwan Basin, it's 38 kilometers away, south-southeast. That's where the Galwan clashes took place, where it says Galwan LAC. This Chinese artillery post is feeding that effort over there. Now, what's been happening in the Galwan line of control? Well, over the last several days, as we've been reporting, there has been a massive build-up And if we can show that image of hundreds of Chinese vehicles, as you can see on the 9th of June, at that particular site, there were no vehicles. On the 16th of June, there were 200 plus vehicles near Indian positions in Galwan. There was also evidence of clashes on the 15th of June. Well, let's just try and get in more reactions, try and understand what this is all about. Joining us, Lieutenant General Subroto Saha, member of the National Security Advisory Board. Good to speak to you, General Saha. We are also joined by Vipin Narang, Associate Professor of Political Science at MIT. General Saha, let me come to you first. The new rules of engagement, I don't know if we should use the word new because they've existed in the past, but they've been given a more robust shape now. That if there are physical skirmishes like what we have seen so far, then our soldiers can retaliate. What sort of difference does this make on the line of actual control? Is it perhaps dangerous because for several decades the existing rules of constraint have by and large worked?
Well, Vishnu, firstly, thanks for having me on your program. You see, the relevance or the tenability of all the protocols and agreements clearly has been lost. The way the breach of trust has been there, the way the breach of the principles have been there, quite clearly these protocols have become unsustainable, and going into the future, I think that is the first issue that will require to be dealt with, because given the way this border is, not defined, not delineated, not demarcated, you cannot be carrying on like this with this kind of, absence of trust. So therefore, if they had become irrelevant, it is but obvious, given the kind of violence that we are witnessing, and it is not as if it was something unplanned for. It was highly pre-planned. Otherwise, you don't, see those very modern-looking medieval weapons being brought over there for use. And like you just mentioned from whatever you were showing, that almost 200 vehicles were there on the 16th June. So 200 vehicles cannot be appearing, suddenly in the morning. They have all obviously come there with a plan, with an intention. So the answer to your question is, if those protocols and agreements have lost their relevance, obviously you would expect the armed forces to work out a fresh rules of engagement which are able to face the current challenges squarely.
Right. Vipin, you've been observing this from a distance. There's been a huge Chinese build-up, but equally there has been an Indian bolstering of our positions. Where do you see this headed given the present ground reality?
First of all, Vishnu, thanks for having me. And I agree with General Saha that confidence-building measures are great as long as there's confidence. But once confidence is lost, I think the Indian Army has every right to defend itself. I also think that by adjusting the rules of engagement, the bar for firing a weapon is higher than using these medieval weapons. And these brawls are getting so brutal and large that in a lot of ways, having the ability to defend oneself with a firearm may actually reduce the chance of escalation and direct clashes. But the broader question is, relaxing the rules of engagement is a tactical level decision. The broader strategic picture is still unknown. What are the Chinese objectives, and how does India restore the status quo ante? And if you look at the buildup, it looks, especially in Pangong Tso between fingers 4 and 8, the Chinese came, to play, and they came to stay. They're not going away unless there's going to be some demand for a price.
The implications of that are dangerous for both sides. I take
Correct.
that point, Vipin. I'm putting words in your mouth. Is that what you were trying to say?
No, that's exactly right. And I think there's also, this Chinese buildup was pre-planned, it's strategic, and there is an objective the Chinese are seeking that I think hasn't been determined yet. And it may be about the road, it may not be about the road. This can only be solved, I think, at a political diplomatic level. This, adjusting rules of engagement are very tactical, and you risk escalation. Even the decision to escalate is a political decision. And I think I'm sure the government of India and the national security, advisors are discussing what they're willing to risk. But the broader question is, how do you get the Chinese to restore the status quo ante? Especially, this just isn't in one place as it was in Doklam. This is in, across a broad swath of the line of actual control.
Right.
And if the Chinese are trying to unilaterally adjust or settle the line of actual control on their terms, then that's something that needs to be resisted.
General Malik, let me come to you next, sir.
Okay. Yeah.
So, General, my question to you is, how do we get the Chinese from here onwards to go back to their positions early April, particularly in the Pangong Lake region?
Vishnu, yes, that has to be the objective, that we should go back to, we should have the status quo ante as it existed in April this year. And I think the attempt has to be a diplomatic level, political level or diplomatic level, but the forces will have to remain alert, will have to remain in the position, because even today the situation is such that it can escalate any place. And in any case, you cannot speak to them, or you cannot have a diplomatic dialogue if it is perceived from the other side from a position of weakness from our side. That cannot be accepted. So yes, attempt has to be diplomatic and political dialogue. I don't think India or China would like to have escalation of this and ending in limited war or whatever.
Yeah.
So we remain alert, we remain prepared for any eventuality while we resume the dialogue at the diplomatic level, military level, or political level.
General Sahab, has there been a change of perspective at the highest levels that you are aware of, where initially we were almost hoping that this situation wouldn't get aggravated, that the Chinese would go away, that they'd come to the table, we'd talk, and then these bloody clashes have taken place. And now we've restarted Lieutenant General level talks. Are we negotiating with a different mindset now, a mindset where, if necessary, we are ready to fight?
That's a very interesting question you asked, Vishnu, because in the first place, what the build-up that they have done, it is part of their typical annual exercises. And from whatever inputs that you have, and you have just given it out for the kind of, mechanized formations, perhaps given the number of vehicles, motorized formations, artillery self-propelled you highlighted, which obviously comes with a mechanized division. So if that is the kind of build-up, it is typically what they have been doing regularly for the exercises. Where they have done the breach of trust is because when you carry out an exercise of that scale within a given range, you are expected by those protocols and agreements to inform the other side. Now, if that information was not shared, obviously there has been a breach or a violation of the principles, call it what you will. The important thing, and which is relevant to your question, is so I don't think that there was ever any doubt that this time around there will be escalation. That it will escalate to something like, as I said, a medieval way of fighting with pretty modern, modernly manufactured medieval tools.
Right.
I think that is actually where people would have got surprised. And I think as far even if the Chinese came prepared the way they did, I think they would have been doubly surprised for the kind of reaction which they got from the Indian side. And now, as more details are emerging, it was not only the people of 16 Bihar, it was people from the neighboring Punjab unit, there were people from the artillery unit over there who went up and responded, at the spur of the moment, depending on the reaction which was required. So clearly, I don't think there is any doubt in anybody's mind that the situation is very, very tense, and there is no doubt in anybody's mind that there is a very high level of escalation. But, well, the flip side is they have agreed to resume the talks, and I think it was meant to be yesterday, but finally it has happened today. And as of now, there is no news to suggest that the talks have broken down, so I suppose the negotiation process has started again.
Yeah.
That said, I must also, put in an element of caution over here. We have to be very, very careful that, this business of prolonging negotiations to improve your build-up is something that we have to watch for, because in terms of forward deployment, we have a certain advantage, and that advantage we must be able to retain and be sure that whatever negotiations that we are doing is able to build in all those advantages as we proceed.
Sure, I think that's an important point, sir, that, we can't be talking or negotiating endlessly. At the end of the day, something needs to be done. The question is what and when. Vipin, over the last several weeks, there's been an incredible debate in this country on the extent of intrusions. Now, satellite imagery has come in, and that clearly indicates that between finger 4 and finger 8 in the Pangong Lake, as you mentioned, as others were mentioning earlier on as well, there is a huge Chinese presence. They don't appear to be set to go anywhere. But in Galwan or in Depsang or in the hot springs area or near the Gogra post, do you really believe that the incursions by the Chinese were as much as many believe they were, or do you believe that these were physically very small incursions which perhaps at the moment do not even exist?
I'll say I don't know. I mean, I'm an amateur image analyst. I usually look at, nuclear weapons in North Korea, and that's hard enough as it is, because, there's a reason why you have the same several people in the intelligence community poring over these pictures day in, day out for years on years, because context matters so much. And there are often mundane explanations for what you may think are spectacular changes in satellite imagery. And at the end of the day, it really doesn't matter, whether there have been mass incursions or not. The reality is that there's clearly an attempt to change the status quo ante. And whether it's on so-called, quote unquote, Indian territory or not, there's no question that the Chinese have amassed forces in places that they previously had not been. And if you look at the Pangong So images, for example, that's the most disturbing, I think, the most clearly disturbing, because these aren't temporary structures. They look like permanent structures that are being erected up through finger 4, blocking, the Indian patrols. And these aren't small structures. This is a massive buildup, and it's an attempt to change the status quo ante. Now, you can say that's not perceived Indian territory, and that's fine, but it is a ground change of the status quo. And there was an attempt, according to the ministry, the readout from Dr. Jaishankar and Foreign Minister Wang, to erect at least a temporary structure just across the line of actual control. And it's these persistent pokes, right? I mean, the strategy from the Chinese seems to be, death by 1,000 pokes in all of these different places. Yeah. And I go back to the bigger questions of why are they trying to change the ground status quo in so many places at once, and what can India's response be? I do think that this point that General Saha made and that you made is absolutely critical, that time benefits the Chinese. The longer they occupy the positions they currently hold, the longer it becomes the status quo, and it'll be much harder to push them back in the future. And so allowing the Chinese to consolidate and fortify those positions is something India, I think, needs to avoid. Otherwise, the fait accompli becomes the status quo ante going forward. Yeah. And so, the general question about whether it's, quote unquote, Indian territory, I think misses the point, which is this is clearly a strategic attempt by China to push on the entire line of actual control for some reason. Yeah. And that needs to be addressed.
General Malik, at what stage is it appropriate for us to be asking a very basic question? Why did we not preempt the Chinese moves in the Pangong Lake area or elsewhere? We have satellite imagery available to us. We've got excellent friends around the world. We have a certain military ability. You headed our army during Kargil. You've written so much about intelligence issues. Is there an element of an intelligence failure which has resulted in this mess that we find ourselves across large parts of Ladakh?
Vishnu, I have not been able to hear Vipin at all, but I was able to hear General Saha. Let me make a point where I am not agreeing with my colleague from the Indian Army. I don't think we should be looking at this instance only when we now start negotiating with them or we start talking to them. The fact is that for last now couple of years, these kind of situations have been escalating. Nobody wants the troops to be getting involved in scuffles, whether it is in Sikkim or it is in Northeast or Chumar or any of these places. So now that we are talking to them, we should also be talking in terms of why have these instances occurred, and why are they also escalating in the kind of weapons, I'm using the word weapons, which are being used now, whether it is north of Pangangso or in Galwan. So I would like to look at these things in a slightly longer perspective and not just this incident only. That is one important point, because it concerns the agreement that we have signed. And
right.
Yesterday, the statement that has been made by the defense minister, it literally neutralizes the 96 agreement or 2005 agreement, which says that you will not fire. The fact is that now they have, the Indian government has given permission that they can fire in self-defense, etc. Now coming to your situation about the intelligence, you people are depending only on the satellite imagery. I am not too sure that is the only source of intelligence. We should also be looking at some other kind of intelligence. But if probably we did not have adequate strength at finger 4, if we had had adequate strength at that time, when we noticed that these people were now occupying area between finger 4 and finger 8, then I'm sure some more people from Indian side would have gone and met them there in that area, and not asked, and at least asked them to not to occupy those positions. So I really don't, I won't be able to say that what kind of information we had, but it is definitely that we did not have adequate troops at that time at finger 4 area. Don't forget, people have to go across the Pangangso to be able to occupy those positions, and that takes time.
Right.
So that's the one reason that they were not, they didn't venture out from their position at finger 4.
All right. Well, I'd like to thank all of you very much for joining us. I think it's clear that it's going to go on for a while before this is sorted out one way or the other. And if it goes on longer, it means that a very large number of Indian soldiers will be deployed in forward positions. Sustaining that is difficult, not just for us, it will be difficult for the Chinese as well. In a few months, when we come into a winter scenario, it becomes doubly or triply difficult. And those are factors which ground commanders will be acutely aware of.